Welcome to Sino Warfare with Ralph D. Sawyer.
As if rules somehow govern the folly of warfare, the world tends to condemn the use of disguise and justify the torture and execution of enemy personnel caught in plain clothes or enemy uniforms by claiming their lack of identifiable attire negates their status as legal combatants. Nevertheless, faced with possible defeat and extinction, more than a few political leaders and many commanders have felt compelled to authorize and adopt disguise. Nefarious efforts, ranging from information gathering to assassination, have always required agents to cloak themselves in anonymity or assume another persona. The complexity of their transformation and its thoroughness, whether a new identity such as a tradesman or a monk needs to be assumed, depends upon the nature of the mission. Although primarily employed by single individuals or small numbers of infiltrators for clandestine purposes, cavalry contingents and army units as large as brigades have historically exploited the advantages disguise can offer. As early as the Warring States period in China, the Six Secret Teachings already advised disguising some men as enemy emissaries provides the means to sever their supply lines. Forging enemy commands and orders and wearing the same clothes as the enemy are the means to prepare for their retreat. And in the Tang Dynasty, the great general Li Jing concluded that having the Chinese and barbarian contingents guarding the border exchange their uniforms would sow havoc because the steppe peoples were accomplished horsemen, whereas the indigenous Chinese forces excelled in using crossbows and fighting from stationary positions. He termed the technique manifesting many methods to cause misperception. The 100 technical terms explication of confusion, Hun, broadens the effects. Quote, when we confuse the enemy's general with a phony army, confuse the enemy's army with a phony general, confuse them both with fortifications and encampments, use the same flags, make our uniforms and armor identical, falsify our clothes and belts, and adorn ourselves in a similar manner, we can take advantage of opportunities to burrow into their very core and attack within. We will be able to distinguish among ourselves, but they will not. Jie Xuan, the author, added, shouldn't we collect the enemy's uniforms, gather up their weapons, practice their drumming and signals, and imitate the enemy's language in order to induce confusion? The southern Song, Cui Wei Bei Zheng Lu, subsequently advised that generals should alter their identifying marks, and they suggested shifting command assignments in order to deceive the enemy's spies. Signals intelligence had yet to evolve, but it was felt that the meaning conveyed by well-established signals, flags and pennants, gongs and drums, even beacon fires, should also be manipulated. The Yunqiu Gongmu bluntly states, quote, making the uniforms the same as the enemy so they cannot be distinguished is the means to frighten them into collapsing and running off in defeat. For example, after suffering several reversals while battling the Millennium group called the Red Eyebrows in the chaotic years preceding the formation of the later Han, Feng Yi regrouped and fortified his camp. Next, he created an ambush force, had them wear the same uniforms as the Red Eyebrows, and deployed them along the enemy's route of attack. When the Red Eyebrows launched their initial assault with 10,000 troops, Feng tepidly responded with a limited force in order to display weakness and lure the enemy forward. Emboldened, the Red Eyebrows attacked with their full force. Feng then released his entire strength and engaged the enemy in a widely ranging clash, but he still didn't release the concealed troops until the enemy's spirit flagged. Caught between unexpected flank attacks and unable to distinguish friend and foe, the Red Eyebrows broke and fled. Feng's army mounted a strong pursuit and eventually destroyed them. At the start of the Three Kingdoms period, Cao Cao's midnight incineration of Yan Shao's provisions, perhaps the most famous raid in Chinese history, succeeded in part because his 5,000 cavalrymen carried the enemy's flags and pennants, and they were therefore able to deceive challengers en route. His bold blow deflated Yuan Shao's more numerous troops, and it set the stage for his own army's extrication from their hopeless plight at Guandu, fundamentally affecting Three Kingdoms history. Apart from the battlefield, carelessly according special treatment to merchants, hunters, and other privileged persons entering and exiting fortified cities could also be exploited to introduce fighters cloaked as ordinary group members and conceal activities and intent. The deception could employ non-combatants equally with soldiers garbed as innocuous peasants. It could be as simple as leading prisoners into a town, camp, or bastion, or as complex as shackling them and having fake family members accompany them. Wounded fighters, whether actual or feigned, might also be employed to gain entrance to neutral and sometimes even enemy cities. The earliest mention of disguise in the Chinese context dates to about 520 BC, when some troops from the state of Jin launched a surprise attack on the small city-state of Gu, which they had earlier subjugated, but allowed to continue in a sort of semi-independent existence. However, when Gu's ruler changed his allegiance to the Xianyu, a so-called barbarian people, Jin quickly responded. The commander of a Jin force then in the nearby Dongyang area disguised some of his troops as grain merchants. After they concealed their weapons in the sacks and their armor on their backs, they approached the city, and they deliberately paused outside the Xiang gate before suddenly mounting a surprise attack on the unsuspecting inhabitants and extinguishing the city. On the personal level, commanders sometimes adopted disguises, even among their own men. Zhuge Liang, the famous Three Kingdoms Chinese strategist, employed as many as 3 doubles, accompanied by an appropriately garbed protective contingent. Conversely, their prominence could also be exploited. For example, Bi Caiyu deliberately paraded a double attired in his distinctive robes atop the parapets to draw the arrows they needed to replenish their depleted supply. And as for other techniques, numerous highly imaginative measures that defy simple categorization were adroitly employed in China to baffle enemies, prompt counterproductive actions, and coerce foes into capitulating. Several unorthodox ploys that heavily rely upon deception came to persist in memory. Some were simple, others proved to be highly elaborate ruses. A variety of methods and props were used in these charades, but dummies, sound, and fire predominate. Perhaps the most famous of these is the empty city ploy previously mentioned, in which a hopelessly outnumbered commander deters an enemy attack through casual behavior and nonchalant measures. Despite its highly melodramatic and dangerous nature, it's basically a static variant of the feigned ambush. The crux lies in exploiting the dynamic interrelationship of the empty and the substantial, a complex topic that requires a separate discussion, to convince potential aggressors that it's a case of pseudo-vulnerability, a ploy, to draw them into a lethal trap. The 36 stratagems and other works all regard Zhuge Liang's famous perpetration of the empty city ploy as the perfect exemplification. Commanders also early on intermixed straw men and heavily cloaked stick figures, sometimes fully equipped with shields or weapons, among actual soldiers atop fortifications or in chariots, and arrayed them in unoccupied areas in both China and the West. They thus thought to augment the army's apparent strength, or sometimes create the facade of ensconced troops where none exist, in order to shape the battle space and constrain the enemy's discernible possibilities. The first recorded Chinese example dates to the spring and autumn period, when the western state of Jin placed dummies in their chariots alongside real men, freeing the normal occupants for deployment elsewhere, as part of their very successful, multifaceted effort to terrorize Qi's ruler, who was known to be a timid and a reluctant warrior, into retreating. Jin not only established outposts throughout the mountains and in the marshy areas, but they also arrayed flags, even where they'd never venture, in order to create the appearance of a truly expansive deployment. They then had men drive the chariots and place the dummies, garbed as warriors, on the right side of the vehicles. They also dragged brush behind the chariots to raise clouds of dust, which would further magnify the apparent size of the force, but also help to obscure the dummy's lifeless nature. Sound. Even when constrained by regulations, armies generate a lot of noise. The creaking of wagons, the grinding of blades, clanking of weapons, the clash of cooking utensils, and other metallic implements all mingle with the din of troops talking and shouting. Moreover, camps normally bristle and fall silent in a daily cycle, except when the troops undertake dedicated attacks, such as fortifying their defenses, preparing for an assault, or maybe shifting their position. Given that repetitive sounds are expected, silence usually indicates unusual developments, especially at night and in fog. Observers therefore carefully listen to them to supplement the intelligence being gained through other means, if any. The range of sounds and their meaning being well known, astute commanders naturally exploited them to foster expectation and deceive the enemy. They were also used to hide movement, conceal empty camps, mask intentions, create imaginary forces, undertake feints, and convey misinformation, such as by changing the meaning of drum beats and signals. Even more effective was employing the trumpets or the drums used to signal attack at carefully chosen points. A few men who could circle an enemy unseen or lie in wait before imitating the sound of a force about to assault a vulnerable flank sometimes induce sufficient fear and disorder to fundamentally change the course of battle. Fires and lights, in the form of torches, campfires for warmth, temporary stoves for cooking. Fire is vital to forces in the field. However, being highly visible in the darkness, they all reveal valuable information about the army's size and position. Inventive commanders therefore manipulated their numbers to suggest increasing or decreasing troop strength, and they dispersed them on distant hillsides and along the edges of forests to fabricate the presence of troops. Now, this concludes our overview of deception in China. Although innumerable details and many possibilities cry out for further investigation, such as 无中生有, or non-being, nothingness, gives birth to being, and we could devote many hours to theoretical expositions, hopefully the series has adequately covered the essentials. The Yunqiu Gangmu states, strategists esteem misleading the enemy. Therefore, the efforts directed towards deception must be multiplied. Despite questions about cultural constraints, presumably because of the largely invariant nature of conflict, virtually every possible form of deception was practiced in both China and the West. The chief difference, I have to reiterate here, lies in China's conscious study of deception and the greater readiness to exploit it whenever possible to manipulate the enemy. As a result, Chinese theory was both sophisticated and cumulative, and the practice of deception complex. Nevertheless, commanders employed it only in a small percentage of the 2,000 or more known conflicts.
As always, thank you for watching.